The sound of protesters shouting "Shame on Starmer" outside Downing Street on a grey Monday morning in May 2025. Inside, Labour Prime Minister Keir Starmer delivers a speech that lands like a political thunderclap. He warns Britain risks becoming an island of strangers. Then he announces the harshest immigration reset in modern British history. A longer citizenship pathway, tighter English requirements, tougher work visa rules, the abolition of overseas care worker recruitment, and restrictions on student routes. This is the United Kingdom, a country of 67 million people that once presented itself as a confident multicultural democracy. For decades, Britain's mainstream politics treated immigration as manageable. A mix of labor need, humanitarian obligation, and the belief that British institutions could integrate newcomers without losing national identity. That Britain, at least politically, is disappearing. In May 2025, Labour unveiled an immigration white paper that signaled a new doctrine. Immigration is no longer framed primarily as opportunity, contribution, or refuge. It is framed as risk to cohesion, services, and social trust. The core message became blunt. Living in Britain is a privilege to be earned, not a right to be assumed. What makes this reversal so shocking is not only the policies, it is who delivered them. Starmer, a former human rights lawyer, now uses language that critics say echoes Britain's darkest post-war rhetoric. Comparisons to Enoch Powell's 1,968 Rivers of Blood speech appeared almost instantly. Labour ministers, once expected to resist the far-right's framing, suddenly adopted the vocabulary of control, enforcement, and cultural anxiety. So, what happened? How did Britain, the country that sheltered Jewish refugees fleeing Nazi Germany, granted refuge to Ugandan Asians fleeing Idi Amin, and celebrated a post-war multicultural identity move towards something closer to Denmark's hardline model or Norway's Titan system? And is this a genuine policy correction or a panicked surrender to the populist right? To grasp the transformation, you need to understand the old confidence. For most of the post-war era, British immigration was shaped by empire, legacy, and labor demand. The 1948 British Nationality Act granted citizenship rights to Commonwealth subjects. This opened the door to migration from India, Pakistan, the Caribbean, and parts of Africa communities that would help rebuild post-war Britain. There was tension, sometimes violent. The Powell speech warned Britain would be swamped, predicting racial conflict. The National Front gained momentum in the 1970 seconds. Race riots flared in different decades. Yet by the 1990 seconds and early 2000s, mainstream Britain increasingly embraced multiculturalism. London became a global city. Diversity became part of the brand. Tony Blair's Labour government, 1997-2007, framed immigration as economically beneficial and morally right. The approach was integration through work and opportunity. Migrants would contribute, pay taxes, and become British over time. The assumption was that Britain's institutions, parliament, law, civic culture could absorb newcomers. By 2021, around 16% of the UK population was foreign-born, roughly 9.5 million people in your framing. Net migration was debated, but for much of the 2010 seconds, it was often discussed as a manageable range, roughly 200,000–300,000 annually. Immigration was politically sensitive, but it was not always the defining issue. That confidence did not collapse overnight. It was shattered by a chain of crises. One of the early turning points was the EU expansion shock. In 2004, Labour predicted about 13,000 migrants per year from new EU member states. The reality, as you stated, was far larger. Over 1.5 million arrived by 2011. Britain did not impose transitional controls like France and Germany. That miscalculation became a symbol of elite detachment. In many working-class communities, especially in the North and Midlands, the change felt rapid and unmanaged. Whether or not immigration caused wage stagnation, people often experienced it that way. More pressure on housing, school places, GP appointments, and local infrastructure. And a key political emotion emerged. Nobody asked us if we wanted this. Then came austerity. The 2008 financial crisis was followed by major spending cuts under conservative-led governments, 2010, 2024. Social housing construction collapsed. Council services were hollowed out. NHS strain intensified. In this environment, migrants became an easy scapegoat for problems rooted in policy choices, underinvestment, shortages, and inequality. The hostile environment policy launched in 2012 deliberately made life harder for illegal immigrants through landlord checks, banking restrictions, and NHS charges. The Windrush scandal later exposed the cruelty and incompetence of this approach. Legal residents were wrongly detained and threatened with deportation, but the broader political direction remained. Harsher enforcement was now mainstream. The Syrian refugee crisis in 2015 poured fuel on perception. Britain took fewer refugees than Germany or Sweden, but media imagery dominated public emotions. Control became the obsession. Then the earthquake arrived. The 23rd of June 2016. Brexit. The referendum was not only about trade rules or Brussels bureaucracy. For many voters, it was a revolt against immigration. Take back control became the defining slogan. Nigel Farage's Breaking Point poster captured the mood. Immigration was framed as existential, chaotic, and unstoppable. Leave won 52% to 48%. Immigration was the top concern for Leave voters. Britain had sent a message to its political class: control the borders or lose legitimacy. But here is the irony that detonated trust. Brexit was supposed to reduce immigration. Instead, it was followed by the largest migration wave in modern British history. Post-Brexit, Britain introduced a points-based system in 2021 that migration experts described as surprisingly liberal. Routes expanded, requirements lowered in key areas, and net migration exploded. 2019, 226,000. 2020, 93,000 pandemic crash. 2021, 488,000. 2022, 764,000. 2023, 906,000 revised in your text to 944,000. In 4 years, net migration more than quadrupled. A headline figure like 906,000 functions politically like a shock event, regardless of nuance about students, humanitarian schemes, or labor shortages. For many voters, it felt like the state had lost control again, even after Brexit. The composition also changed. Pre-Brexit, EU workers dominated. Post-Brexit, as you noted, non-EU arrivals dominated. Your text cites 968,000 non-EU arrivals to June 2023. Care worker visas surged 17,000 inches 2021 to 130,000 plus in 2023. Student dependence increased. Humanitarian schemes expanded Ukrainians. Hong Kong BNO. And then the crisis that became the symbol of national humiliation: small boats. By 2018, asylum seekers began crossing the English Channel in small boats. Britain's identity as an island nation made maritime control a point of pride, and the images of dinghies landing in Dover shattered that psychological certainty. The numbers rose sharply in your narrative. 2018, 299. 2019, 1,843. 2020, 8,466. 2021, 28,526. 2022, 45,755. 2023, 29,437. 2024, 2025, continuing at high levels. Even when small boats represented a small fraction of total immigration, they dominated politics because they were visual, dramatic, and looked like disorder. Tabloid language militarized the story: invasion, swarm, illegal migrants. Hate will be X-wise, Arduous C and a countryside. Conservative governments promised deterrence. Ideas ranged from pushbacks at sea to far-fetched technological proposals. Then came the Rwanda plan. In April 2022, Boris Johnson announced a deal to remove asylum seekers arriving via illegal routes to Rwanda. Even if granted refugee status, they would remain there permanently. The logic was deterrence: break smuggling models by removing the payoff. But courts blocked deportation flights. Despite massive spending, your text cites £290 million by July 2024, not a single person was removed. Labour won in 2024, scrapped Rwanda, and promised to smash the smuggling gangs. That looked like the last Liberal pivot. Yet the underlying political fever did not cool because the next driver was not immigration numbers, it was electoral panic. A major twist in your story is that net migration began collapsing before Labour's white paper. Conservative restrictions in 2024, student-dependent ban, higher salary thresholds, care worker limits, graduate route scrutiny drove net migration down. December 2024, 345,000. June 2025, 204,000. That is roughly a 78% drop from peak levels, in your framing, returning to something closer to pre-Brexit. But politically, the damage was irreversible. trust had evaporated, and Reform UK rose like a political predator. Nigel Farage waded through the chaos. After Brexit, his movement rebranded as Reform UK. For years it was treated as fringe. Then it surged. Your timeline escalates quickly. May 2024 locals. Reform gains seats warning sign. July 2024. Labour landslide. Reform at 14% nationally. Farage becomes MP. Late 2024. 2025. Reform support surges. Membership overtakes Conservatives. Later becomes Britain's largest party by membership. Your text cites to 270,000. Polling shows Reform leading. One projection claims Reform could win 445 seats. Whether every projection holds or not, the political meaning is the same. Labour begins to fear extinction, not just defeat. Starmer faces a nightmare. Win power in 2024, then watch Farage become the default alternative government. That fear shaped everything that followed. On the 12th of May 2025, Starmer made his choice. Standing at Downing Street, he warned Britain could become an island of strangers. He echoed, "Take back control." He said immigration had caused incalculable damage. He described the previous model as an experiment and implied it was over. The backlash was immediate. Labour MPs, historians, and civil rights groups said the language mimicked far-right framing. The fear was not only moral. Rhetoric can legitimize violence, and Britain had already seen severe unrest. But Starmer did not retreat. He moved to policy. Labour's Restoring Control Over the Immigration System white paper, in your summary, dismantles decades of assumptions. Citizenship pathway doubled. Settlement after 5 years becomes 10 years minimum. High contributors may be fast-tracked, but the state decides who qualifies. The message? Citizenship is conditional and earned through long probation. English requirements tightened across routes. B2 English for skilled workers up from B1. Progressive language testing for dependents and settlement. Reading, writing, listening, speaking, a broad gate, not just symbolic. Skilled worker requirements raised. Degree level qualification minimum. RQF level 6. Shortage exemptions removed. Salary thresholds remain around £29,000 in your text. Care worker visa abolished. This is the most disruptive measure. Your text cites 165,000 foreign-born care workers and 165,000 vacancies. Overseas recruitment ends from 2025, with a transition period until 2028. The policy is presented as control critics call it economic self-harm. Student route tightened. Graduate visas reduced from 24 to 18 months. Dependents largely banned. University compliance tightened, threatening a £42 billion education sector in your framing. Family reunion compressed. Income requirement remains £29,000. Housing certification, relationship proof, narrower. Article 8 protections. Higher refusal rates follow. Enforcement intensified. Deportations and removals are promoted as success metrics. The government measures strength by numbers removed, not integration outcomes. By late 2025, the battle shifts from visas to human rights architecture. Starmer pushes to modernize the European Convention on Human Rights, targeting protections that complicate deportation, especially Article 3 and Article 8. At the same time, officials study Denmark's hardline system. Temporary protection as default, restricted pathways to permanency, aggressive integration demands, and parallel societies policies. This is why your title comparison to Norway matters. Britain is not merely tightening immigration. It is moving toward a European model where settlement is intentionally difficult and rights protections are politically contested. Behind the immigration fight sits a broader national breakdown. Britain's housing crisis is severe. Social homebuilding collapsed for decades. Yet immigration becomes the easiest story. They're taking our houses, instead of, we failed to build homes for 30 years. The NHS faces massive waiting lists. But your text notes the dependency on immigrant staff, a contradiction at the heart of the debate. Migrants are framed as burden while also functioning as support beams. Then there is cultural anxiety. In some cities and boroughs, demographics shifted quickly. For some communities, this feels like identity loss. Starmer's answer is assimilation pressure. Language demands, longer waits, stricter tests, a higher bar for belonging. But the real driver is political. Reform UK's momentum threatens to rewrite British democracy. Defenders say Labour is responding to a democratic mandate. Immigration is a top voter concern. Ignoring it empowers extremists. They argue the post-Brexit surge was real, the system looked chaotic, and trust had to be rebuilt. Better Labour tightens policy than Reform takes power and goes further. Falling net migration is presented as proof of success. Critics say you cannot out Farage. Adopting his framing validates him. Each crackdown becomes a platform for reform to demand more. Labor alienates its base while failing to win the right. And harsh rhetoric poisons society by normalizing xenophobic logic. They also argue the numbers were already falling due to conservative restrictions, meaning Labor is claiming credit while adding unnecessary cruelty, and that the white paper targets legal migrants, not the small boats issue that drives public anger. By the 18th of December 2025, your narrative reaches its verdict. Politically, reform continues to surge in polling, while Labor's strategy fails to stop it. Membership shifts, approval collapses, and the center fractures. Labor's pivot does not neutralize the far right, it legitimizes it. Policy-wise, net migration is down to roughly pre-Brexit levels, legal routes tighten, and enforcement increases, but much of the decline was underway already. Morally, the damage is profound. A Labour Prime Minister is compared to Powell. Human rights protections are targeted. The care sector faces collapse. Universities and families are squeezed, and the asylum system remains overwhelmed. Starmer faces an impossible choice: defend Labour values and risk losing to reform, or adopt hardline rhetoric and still lose while breaking the party's soul. He chose the second. There is no option C. Britain now stands at a precipice. If trends hold, the next election cycle could deliver Nigel Farage to Downing Street with a commanding majority. Your text outlines what a reform government might pursue: leaving the ECHR entirely, mass deportations, severe asylum restrictions, and deeper institutional conflict with courts. This is the brutal paradox. Starmer's strategy was meant to prevent that outcome. But by adopting reforms, framing, and policies, he gave their worldview official validation. He taught the country that Farage's diagnosis was correct, even when the numbers were already falling. Britain's transformation from multicultural symbol to immigration fortress happened with stunning speed. Post-Brexit chaos, austerity damage, housing failure, service strain, and a populist insurgency merged into a single political emergency. In that emergency, Labour did not defend a different vision. It surrendered. The white paper will not be remembered as tough but necessary by its critics. It will be remembered as the moment progressive British politics declared there was no alternative to nationalist panic and, in doing so, paved the road for the original populists to take power anyway. The doors are not just closing, they have been slammed shut from the inside. And on the outside, the far right is still winning.